In this video, I demonstrate how to paint reflections by painting this still life painting of shiny objects. Here's my reference photograph. There's a bunch of reflections in here. There's the vase, and it's in here twice. I have the head-on view of it, which picks up the color of the background, but we also have the view from the mirror, which is more neutral. So we have reflections in both of these, plus there's the reflection here in the countertop, which is kind of complicated, and the mirror itself is a reflection of a reflection. So what makes painting reflections difficult is all these complex shapes. One thing I use is a grid for things like this. So I drew this on a clear piece of acetate, and I used geometry to create these gridded off sections. In my video about how to paint transparent glass, I go through this entire process. It's not that hard, but it does help you to get a more accurate drawing. So that's one of my first tips, is that you need to have an accurate drawing in order to do reflections like this. Basically, the grid helps you to get objects in the right place and the right size. So for example, the bottom of this mirror is right where this X is, which is the halfway point of this rectangle. I can also use it to get an idea of how far the countertop should be. It's just a little bit below the middle of this square right here. If you'd like to follow along, you can download this photograph for free. There's a link to my free email newsletter in the description. Once you sign up, you'll have access to this photograph and the other ones I used in my recent paintings. I wear gloves to make the cleanup easier. It also helps prevent paint from getting underneath your nails. I have a health and safety video for painting. There's a link to it in the related video section below. So the colors I'm using are phthalo blue. These two ringers really help to get the extra paint out of a tube. I recommend getting a metal one because they last a long time. Ultramarine blue. Quinacridone magenta. Pyrrole red. Benzimidazoline yellow medium. This is a transparent yellow. Cadmium yellow primrose. Titanium white. I put out more white because I use it more than any other color. This looks odd, but this is my leftover paint from previous paintings. I call it palette gray, and I store it in a syringe. It's like an airtight paint tube that you can reuse over and over again. I made an entire video on this. There's a link to it in the related video section in the description below. Once you put the cap on it, it's airtight. I've had this paint in here for a year. I still have half of it left. I think I could use some of it in this painting because there's some gray areas in the mirror and the countertop. These markers contain the same pigments as their professional line of heavy body acrylics or soft body acrylics. They're water resistant when they're dry, and they shouldn't fade. They have the same light fast ratings as their heavy body acrylics. I draw the grid on here with a watercolor pencil. That way when I'm done, I can just wipe it off with a damp rag. The marker is water resistant, so it stays put. There's an entire video about this process. There's a link to it in the related video section in the description below. The idea is I start with a light color, and it doesn't matter if I make mistakes. You can see here that there's lighter colors at the top here, and then I refined it with a darker color. The benefit of this is that I don't spend any time erasing my drawing. Once the drawing gets a little bit too cluttered, I pick up a darker color and go over the top of it and start refining it. In this drawing, I think I'll do some final tweaks with this Posca black marker. It has a finer point, and I should be able to get in there. I just want to refine the bottom section here a little bit. I'm going to start by mixing some of the basic colors. The reason why I pre-mix some of the colors is because acrylics dry faster. That way when I'm blending something, I don't have to stop to mix a new color. I have most of the colors already mixed, and I could just dip into them and adjust them as I needed. So that way if I have my palette knife out, I might as well mix a bunch of colors at once. And then when I'm done with that, I could just focus on applying the paint to the canvas. I think I'll mix the background color first. I'll start with the light blue, and when I'm done with that, I can mix the darker blue. So I think it'll be mostly ultramarine. I do think I'll need some phthalo blue in here because the ultramarine blue is biased a little bit towards magenta. That's too light. I'll put more phthalo blue in there. I think it has to go a little darker. Let's see, maybe a little ultramarine will help. And I often do this where I'll test it off to the side to see if it gets to where I need it to be. A little bit more. I think that's about right. So I'll just add more ultramarine to the whole batch. Since this is a background color, I'm going to mix a larger volume of this. I mixed the larger batch of it. Now I can mix the dark blue. I turned it sideways just so I have more room. So I think I'll start with the phthalo blue and quinacridone magenta. Creates like a dark bluish purple color. So I think my color is a little too dark. I could add a touch of white to it. And it doesn't really need that much. Titanium white has a lot of tinting strength to it. The thing I notice is this blue is too saturated. So I think a little bit of benzylmidazoline yellow will help make it less saturated. You could use any transparent yellow. The thing about using something like cadmium yellow is that it's opaque and that would lighten the color. So that did make it a little bit greenish, but I can add more of the magenta in there and that will counteract the green. It could go slightly lighter, maybe a little bit more dull, but that's the basic color. So I'll go ahead and mix up a larger batch of this. I mixed up more of it and I think that's a pretty good match. Next I'll mix the gray for the mirror. I'll start with my leftover gray. This is from all my previous paintings. When I'm done with my painting, I usually just scrape up all the wet paint and mix it together. Depending on the colors, you end up with like a brown or maybe a neutral gray like this. So this is too dark, I'll add more white to it. It's really nice being able to reuse your leftover paints because artist grade paints are pretty expensive. So that's lighter, but I think the photograph has more magenta in that gray. So I'll add a little bit of quinacridone to it. So that's getting pretty close. I'll add more. And as I mentioned in my previous videos, sometimes your printer is actually off in the color. So you really have to use your own judgment. That's not too bad. I think I'll just mix some white in here for this side. Maybe a little bit lighter, but the middle part is pretty close. So maybe I'll do this as like different steps of grays here, where I'll have this for the left side, this for the middle, and the lightest color will be for the right side of the mirror. I think that works. This is one of the reasons why I mix my colors beforehand, is because when I'm blending this background, I can just dip into the dark color, the midtone, and the highlight. I won't have to stop, put down my brush, and pick up a palette knife and mix all these things. You don't have to do it this way, but it's something that makes sense when you paint with acrylics because they dry faster. And I think I could use that as a base color for this countertop. Might have to add a little bit of blue and magenta for this section over here, but I think it's a good place to start. I think I'll mix the wood color for the mirror next. Brown is pretty easy to mix. You just think of it as a dark orange or a dark red. And I think I'll use the cadmium yellow because it'll be more opaque. A little bit of the pyrrole red, and I think that's too much. It needs to be more of a yellow orange. To make that more brownish, just add some blue to it. That would probably work for the darker sections. I think if I add yellow and white to it, I'll be able to do the highlight colors. That's not too bad. As I work, I can add a little bit more white for that section, but this is a good place to start. I'm going to go ahead and mix up a larger quantity, and then I'll come back and mix a few more colors. For the leaves, I'll mix up a dark green from ultramarine blue and cadmium yellow primrose. As I said, the ultramarine is biased towards magenta, and that magenta makes it duller. If I were to use phthalo green, it'd be incredibly vivid. I have an entire video on how to mix different shades of green. There's a link to it in the related video section in the description below. That might be good for the lightest sections, but for the darker section, I'll just use more ultramarine. And I think it needs some pyrrole red just to make it less saturated. A little bit more of the blue. It's not too bad. I think more yellow. I think I'll start with that. I think I have enough colors to get started. Next, I'll just remove this grid that I drew with a watercolor pencil. So to remove the watercolor pencil, I just use a wet rag. You could use a regular pencil and just leave it in there and paint over it. One psychological trick to make a painting feel like it's going faster is to start with the big open areas. So in this case, I'll do the blue background. So the very first step, I'll have the majority of this background filled in. And that also helps define the edges of the flowers and the mirror. This is a synthetic brush. It's from Princeton. It's the Aqua Elite. You can use any inexpensive nylon bristle brush for acrylics. The 1-inch flat is probably my most used brush. The other thing about painting the background first is it gives it a chance to tack up. That way, if I need to touch it up at the end of the painting, I can paint over the top of it. Painting wet paint on top of wet paint is kind of tricky. That's usually a problem for oil painting, but it's also an issue with acrylic sometimes. In order to paint this round corner, I'll turn it upside down just so it's easier to get at. While I have it upside down, I think it'd be easier to get into this shape too. The blue does start to get darker right around here, so I think it's a good time to start mixing in some of the darker color. So I'll just add a little bit in here. I might have to adjust it a little bit more too, like maybe a little more magenta. It's not too bad for that area. I'm not going to blend this perfectly because, like I said, I'll probably come back and put a second coat on it. I'm going to use a second brush for the darker color. That way I can avoid cleaning my brush. I could just switch back and forth between them. If you watched any of my other videos, you'll notice that I often lean my brushes against the side of the palette. That works fine if you have like one brush or two brushes, but after a while I might have like 5 brushes on here and it gets in the way. So what I did is I built this wet brush holder from scrap wood. So far it seems to work pretty well. I drilled 1/2-inch holes in here so the brush won't roll off. It protects my desk and it keeps my palette clutter free. So I put it between my palette and my easel. I'll take some time and cut in around the shapes of these flowers. Sometimes I paint straight lines just by using the edge of the flat brush. I might actually soften that up when I paint in the countertop, but it's just a quick way to put that in there. I switched to a different brush to put in this lighter color. I have the outline filled in around these leaves and flowers. I'll just take a little bit of time to smooth this out just a little bit. I'll work on the vase next with all the reflections. I'll probably start by putting in some of the background color that I mixed up earlier. Here's the darker section. I'm working in some of this lighter color that I mixed up earlier, and that's because there's like a gradient effect in the background. I use my second brush for the highlight color on the right of the mirror. So the lightest section would be right here. You might have to go a little bit lighter. I'll add some white to it. I have a couple different shades of gray in here, and they're not blended that well. It's almost like there's banding in here. So I could just take a soft brush and soften those edges up. You have to clean off the bristles before you start working into the darker sections. So every now and then I just wipe it off. It's good for now. I'll start working on the vase itself, and it's mostly the same background color but with like a green tint on top of it. Plus there's the shadow sections, so I'll have to mix up a little bit of a darker color. Here's some of that leftover gray color. I think it needs a little bit of magenta because it's too greenish. Might work for that darker section right there. And I'll mix up a little bit more, but then I'll lighten it for the middle part. I could use this color for that section right there, and then add more white to it. Here's the key to thinking about how to paint transparent objects. I have this transparent color to acetate. So there's a blue one, and then there's like this pinkish one. And because they're transparent where they overlap, they create a new color. So you think you'd put down a transparent layer of blue and then a transparent layer of pink. And you can do a painting that way, but another way to do it is to mix this color, paint it in opaquely, mix this color, paint it in opaquely, and then do the same thing for the light blue. And that creates the illusion that these shapes are overlapping each other. I could go through the exercise of mixing these 3 colors, but I think it's pretty obvious that that's how you create a transparent effect. You could paint it in transparent layers, but it's really difficult to control how much pigment goes down. When you paint it opaquely, you could just mix the color and it'll be dead on. That's why color mixing is important. If you mix this color pretty accurately, along with the other ones, it creates the illusion that they're transparent. If you want to go more in depth into how to mix colors, I have a color mixing course in the description below. I'll have to add more white to this as I go across the vase. So that's the color I mixed up, and I'll add a little bit of white to it as I progress across the vase. It's a little bit lighter. Also notice there's a lighter section up here. And that looks like it's pretty close to what's on this side, so I'll just put that in there real quick. I mixed up this darker color for the edge of the vase. I didn't use black because it's often too neutral, and these colors that look like black or grays often have color in there. I made an entire video about why I don't use black paint. There's a link to it in the description below. In that video, I paint strawberries in a stainless steel bowl. I don't use any black or neutral gray colors. So the other key to painting glass is just finding all these abstract shapes and painting them as they are. So once you capture these abstract shapes and the gradients, it starts to look transparent. It's like those sheets of colored acetate. I'm mixing the actual colors here. It's not as if I'm putting down transparent layers. You can use glazes to adjust colors, but I start off with a solid color first. These are the basic shapes. I can go back in and put in like those white highlights later, and there's like little lines that go in there. Next, I think I'll start blending this in to the lighter color. The color I picked up is a little bit too greenish, so I'll add some more magenta to my brush. When you first put in these colors, it looks weird and it doesn't look right. But as long as the color is accurate, just keep going. It'll eventually start to make sense. In the last video, I painted a white bowl of fruit, and one side of the bowl was like kind of like a neutral gray, and the other side was like this dark orange color. Didn't look right when I first put it in, but it made sense as I put in more and more of the shapes. Next, I'll start blending it into this really bright highlight. That's the edge of the meniscus of the water level. So I painted that white line in, and then I picked up some of the gray color. That way I have some white paint on the panel that I can blend into. I'm going to take a walk and eat lunch, so I'll just mist it with water, put the lid on it, and that should keep the paints wet until I get back. I'll work on this view of the vase where you can see the blue through the glass. It's really interesting how different the colors are depending on what's behind it. So this is darker and it's much more blue. The whole outside edge has a darker blue color. It's almost black. This view of the vase should be easier than the reflection. I think the shapes are simpler and it's also larger. This is mostly this dark blue color and it fades into the outside darker color. And on top of that, there are these like white highlights that make it look more reflective. And I'll have to put the white in over here too. It's the reflections that make it look like glass. It can be difficult to tell what certain colors are, especially when it's like an abstract reflection like this. So you can use like a color isolator to look at the color by itself. So that was like this dark color, but a little bit more grayish. I think it needs to be warmed up a bit. A little bit of yellow and red. It has to go a little bit lighter. It's actually not too bad. I'll put that in for now. I'm going to paint the reflections on the countertop next, but I think it helps to put the wood color in first because that's what creates the reflection here on the countertop. And once I get the wood color in, it'll make it easier for me to keep track of these shapes. I let this dry overnight. It's pretty much dry to the touch. A couple areas feel a little tacky, but I can paint over this pretty easily. I'm going to focus on the reflection on the countertop. I think I'll finish off this wood piece, then I'll start working on the reflection, which is basically like painting this mirror, but upside down and transparent. I'm going to mix up some of this countertop color. So I'm using my leftover gray paint. It's too dark, I'll add white to it. And it needs more magenta. I like to put a blob of it off to the side so I can dip into it when I need it. It's close, but I think it needs more magenta. Maybe a little bit lighter. It's a pretty good starting point. I'm going to need to mix various shades of this, but this is a good base color to start with. This section here is more blue from the background. I moved this pinkish gray to the top, then I'll mix more of the bluish color underneath it. It's pretty much the same thing, I'll just add blue to it. So I know it needs to go lighter. You might be thinking this is tedious, mixing all these colors and being precise about it. But if you want to create realistic reflections, that's what you need to do. So it needs more blue, and I think I'll use phthalo, a very small amount of it. And I can just tell by looking at it, it's going to need magenta because it's kind of like a bluish purple. Definitely needs way more blue. Maybe I'll add a little bit of ultramarine. Ultramarine doesn't have as much tinting strength, so it's not going to overpower this too quickly. Still needs more magenta and blue. It's getting closer. I think I'll put a little bit more phthalo in there. And more magenta to make it more purple. It's close, but it's too dark, so I'm adding more white to it. That's about right. I'll start by taking some of this blue color and painting it around the outside of the vase. It seems too dark, but I think it's because the white of the panel makes it look darker than what it actually is. When I compared it to the print, it looks pretty close. So I'll just quickly fill this in. This edge doesn't have to be perfect because I'll probably soften it later when I redo the background. It's pretty much the same color over here, but I think it's a little bit more blue and purple. So that's easy. I'll just dip into some of this blue and magenta. And that's pretty close. I think just maybe a little bit more blue. This is another example of just blocking in a large area, and it makes it feel like you accomplished something in a short amount of time. It's also just a base coat for putting the countertop textures on top of it. The tedious part is going to be this section right here, and that's what I'll work on next. This is the color that's a little bit more magenta. It's the same thing. I'll just scrub it in real quick. This is the color of the wood and the reflection. This is kind of tricky because what you see up here has to be repeated down here. For example, if I make this too thick, it won't look so much like a reflection. The other thing is the perspective has to line up. So this line should continue downwards at the same angle. If it starts going off in this direction, it won't look right. This color is a little tricky. It's the color of the flower, but it's also combined with the color of the countertop because it's a reflection. That's the whole issue with all these weird shapes in here. This is the petal, the white petal of the flower. This is the green leaf. I'll have to mix up a slightly greenish version of this gray color. And I'm just slowly plunking away at putting in these shapes. It doesn't look quite right yet, but once I get it all in there, it should make more sense. I'll start working on the leaves next. This is the dark green mixture that's mostly ultramarine blue and red. A few areas require a more vivid green for the highlights. It helps to look at things as being highlights or shadows. So I have a dark green and a light green, and then I can mix them together to create like midtones. But for now, I just sort of block them in to establish the shapes. I have most of this blocked in, so I'll move on to painting the same leaves in the reflection in the mirror. This leaf in the center is the darkest, and that color continues on through the stems. I'll come back and touch these leaves up later. The last thing that needs to be blocked in are the flowers. This is mostly an off-white color, but there are sections of it that turn more yellowish and greenish. I'm just filling these parts in, and I'll come back in and put the darker sections in. Overall, there's some detail work I need to do, and I have to smooth some things out. I'll probably paint the background again because it's a bit streaky. Some of the white is showing through this paint. But the countertop also needs some subtle texture in here, and there's a color shift that happens. So this will take a little bit of time, but I'll jump over most of it so this video doesn't get too long. Here's the finished painting. I like the contrast between the dark blue and the lighter colored flowers. Another favorite part is the difference between the colors of the same vase and the subtle reflections in the countertop. If you'd like this video, then check out my acrylic painting playlist. I have videos on how to blend student acrylics, how to paint transparent glass, and more. Thanks for watching.